We're continuing on now, basically with the Reformation, and we're going now to Austria. In Strasbourg, a man named Martin Bucer began to teach a very extreme form of predestination. Predestination is a very complicated issue. When you read the scriptures, you cannot doubt that at the moment I'm born, even before I'm born, God knows whether I'm going to be saved or lost. That's part of the knowledge of God. God must know that because God knows everything. And then it's clear in the scriptures that whether I'm saved or lost has to do with my works. Faith without works is worthless. Has to do with the way I demonstrate or live my faith. And so there's this ongoing thing. In fact, it's so difficult a problem to deal with. In the Catholic Church, we're forbidden to debate it, that it became a huge problem in the church. Some people want to say God creates everyone to be saved. In that case, it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be saved. Predestination. The other group says that God knowingly creates me to go to hell and knowingly creates someone else to go to heaven, which is absurd. You can't imagine God doing that. So it's a very, very difficult problem to work with. And oftentimes, people on both sides have gone to extremes. That was a central problem at the time of the Reformation. And I should say it's a problem that in no way is solved today. Theologians get close to it, but they dance around it. You can't just resolve it that way. So anyway, he said that God chose who would be saved and who would be lost, and human beings had no part in it at all. So if you're born to be saved, it doesn't matter what you do with your life, ultimately you're under heaven. And if Mother Teresa was born to be damned, it wouldn't matter what she did in her entire life, she would be lost. Okay? It's a very strange position. So he held this. And he stressed the great independence of the church from civil authorities and gave the church the right to oppose authorities hostile to the church. It was very difficult at this time to understand the distinction between church and civil government, and it has to do with kings. Because when we talk about kings, we talk about the divine right of kings. So a king is a king by the divine choice of God. And so the point where religion starts and country ends, and that was very, very foggy. And this man, I think, had a very good position. He realized the church and the government are separate, and it's the duty of the church to call the government to morals. Okay? Like we have no right to say how states should be divided up, how this sort of thing, but religion has the right to call a government to be more moral. Okay? The Protestant movement gave great birth to a huge stress on the inner life of the Christian. And again, when this is pushed too far, the church itself becomes unimportant, so that the whole thing is my relationship with God. The Roman Catholic position, we believe that each individual is to have a personal relationship with God. And it's the duty of the church to gather us together to celebrate that relationship and to educate that relationship. Okay? And so that's how the church relates to this interrelationship with God. But it's possible to develop the interrelationship to the point where the church doesn't matter. And it's possible, and this is dangerous in the Catholic Church, it's possible to develop the church to the point where the interrelationship doesn't matter. So that I go to Mass on Sunday, I receive the sacraments, I'm doing what I'm supposed to, that's it. That's the church thing. So all of these things, the reason they became problems is because they are difficult issues to understand. I have kind of mentioned this before, but one of the great teachings of Thomas Aquinas, in Latin, it's in medio stat virtus. And he says, virtue always stands in the middle. And his analysis is like, if you're too merciful, You'd forgive everyone, everything, and nothing would be solved in our society. A society can't be too merciful. On the other side, you can't be too strict. You have to hold it in the middle, and that's why we have judges and courts where they can look at a person who's two people who did the same thing. One guy who planned it was malicious and this sort of thing. The other guy who accidentally got into it, so that the courts are able to somehow deal with things in this way, and to blend mercy and to blend the strictness can be blended in the middle. I think all of it, it's a good way to look at with regards to food. If you stop eating, that'll kill you. It's called anorexia. If I keep eating, I will explode, and that'll kill me too. Two sides, the virtue always stands in the middle. So, as a result of this, he taught that very few people were be saved, and the sacraments were of absolutely no value. This is because of the stress on the inner life, okay? It should be noted that Luther very strongly opposed this position. Luther himself condemned this position. Now, the Anabaptists, remember we talked about Huss very early in this. He's one of the very earliest reformers. And he talked about the independence of the churches. And descended from him are the Baptists. But between Huss and the Baptists are the group that came to be known as the Anabaptists. And the Anabaptists came around, the middle 1500s. So the Anabaptists followed this path, the one I mentioned, about the church being relatively unimportant. As a result, they refused infant baptism, and they baptized only adults, that you had to have the faith in order to approach the baptismal thing, thus rebaptizing members and gaining the name Anabaptist. Anabaptist means to rebaptize. So they came to be known as Anabaptists, and that's because if a Catholic joined them, they were rebaptized. If a Lutheran joined them, they were rebaptized, because you had to have baptism as an adult. In the Catholic Church, every sacrament has two sides, and the two sides need to be there for a sacrament to be complete. The two sides are always a sacrament side and a God side, if you want. The God side of baptism is faith, and the sacrament side is the pouring of water. So in a regular Roman Catholic like myself, the water was poured before I had faith. And educated at a set point in my life, I come to faith and make this decision with regard to Jesus. The sacrament's complete. If you have an adult join the church, the adult has already made the decision before the water is poured, but the sacrament's not complete until the water and the faith are there, okay? We know this best with reconciliation. If I commit a terrible sin and turn to God and tell him I'm sorry, I'm within the sacrament of reconciliation, and it's complete when I get absolution. If I'm not sorry for what I did and I go into the sacrament, nothing really happens. I don't find forgiveness if I'm not sorry for the sin. And incidentally, it doesn't work around the other way around like baptism, really, because you cannot sin until you're an adult. You have to know what you're doing to sin. So, going on, the Anabaptists, following this, refused infant baptism, would baptize only adults. They rejected the Mass. They lived in small communities apart from other people. Many of them were pacifists. We find that with regards to a lot of these smaller groups. They owned all property in common. You can see when you study the Anabaptists, they were attempting to reproduce the first century church, okay? So they were doing that. They were persecuted both by Catholics and by Protestants, okay? Neither side was very happy with them. One branch of the group, incidentally, were followers of a man called Minos Simmons, and you may have heard them before, the Mennonites. The Mennonites are the descendants of the people who followed this, and they were part of the Anabaptist movement. Now, Henry VIII became king in England in 1509, and at the beginning of his reign, he was an extremely strong Catholic. And he wrote a book defending all the sacraments against the views of Luther. Now, remember I told you that initially Luther changed very little about the church. But as he became more angry in the polemic with the Pope, he began to attack things that would be really important to the Pope. So he began to attack whether Jesus was in the Eucharist and stuff like that. And so that began to be changed. Luther's position on the Eucharist is that when we have the consecration at Mass, Jesus is not present in the Eucharist. But after we have the consecration, during the distribution of communion, when the minister gives you communion, if you have faith, then you have Jesus. So it's a combination of your faith and the sacrament itself, okay? And that was basically Luther's position. Incidentally, what the Catholic Church did in opposition to Luther at that time was develop benediction, where we had this whole ceremony around the host that no one had received, okay? So the reaction came that way. Anyway, Henry VIII wrote that book, a fairly good book. He had a lot of help from Thomas More, who was a brilliant lawyer at the time. This action, it gained for him the title Defender of the Faith. The Pope imposed this title on him. It's curious to me that long after separating from the Church, in England, Defender of the Faith is still one of the titles of the King of England. So, he had one very serious problem. He had no legitimate sons and was concerned about how succession would take place. Now, if you look at the dates of Henry VIII, 1509, you realize how close he is to the Norman invasions. When the Normans came in, they reestablished royalty, and there was a fight back and forth in different families. And Henry's family finally triumphed, the Tudors. They came over from France, and they triumphed in the fight for the kingship. So now he's king. But he has a daughter, Mary, and he has absolutely no sons. And he's so very concerned about the succession. Since the arrival of William the Conqueror, there have been several shifts in royal succession until his own grandfather established this house of Tudor. There was at this time a man who gained a great reputation in England, both for his wisdom and his holiness, and that's Thomas More. Thomas More, in going through school, was recognized as such a brilliant student. He was studying church law. And so they wanted him to become a priest. And under the spiritual director he had for a time, they discussed back and forth whether he should be a priest. And finally, Thomas More said that he said, as a priest, I would go to hell, but as a layman, I can find salvation. And he said that largely because of his interest with regards to having a family. So he left the study for the priesthood, but continued study for law. Thomas More probably is the last man in history to have a complete knowledge of church law and civil law, okay? He's probably the last man in history. I think, as we go on in time, things become more complicated. And just to use law, I'll avoid the church, but if you use civil law today, like if you're looking for a lawyer, you decide whether you're looking for a lawyer who does contracts, or looking for a lawyer who defends criminals, looking for a lawyer who deals with divorce. You have to find the right lawyer because no lawyer knows it all today. That's too complex. Church law is the same way. The church law is I know church law with regards to liturgy. I do not know church law with regards to marriage. It's just, it's a very complicated thing. So anyway, Thomas More knew all of that. Henry, noting his reputation, advanced him through a number of public offices to the office of Chancellor. The Chancellor of England basically ran the country. And what he would do, the king, some kings were just involved in the ceremonies and allowed the Chancellor to totally run the kingdom. Henry VIII didn't do that. Henry VIII actually ran the kingdom, but his Chancellor was where he got all his information. And one of the reasons why he really liked Thomas More had a great reputation for justice and honesty while he was a judge. And so he was advanced to being a judge, and the rich people claimed that he wouldn't, deal with this sort of thing, but he did not take bribes. He was very, very consistent with that. Henry and Thomas became great friends, and Henry came to rely very heavily on Thomas for advice. And again, I think if you look at the document that Henry wrote in order to defend the sacraments, you could almost see the hand of Thomas in huge parts of it. I'm going to tell you something now that they very seldom talk about in the life of Henry VIII. But Henry VIII was very seriously injured in a jousting accident and was unconscious for several days. For several days, he did not come to consciousness. And most people were convinced that Henry was finished, that he was dying. He came out of that event and was a changed man, okay? He was very seriously changed. Up to this point, he was very, very concerned, for instance, about his relationship with the church. After this, he was not. Before this point, he was extremely concerned about the fact that he wanted to find a successor, but would not violate his marriage commitment to Catherine of Aragon. He and Catherine had been deeply in love. It wasn't a political marriage. We're deeply in love. And he came out of this, though, with the idea that he would marry someone else. And he fell in love with Anne Boleyn. Incidentally, Anne had an older sister called Mary, and she had had an affair with King Henry VIII earlier. I mentioned that Henry had no legitimate sons. Henry had a number of illegitimate sons. And it was very common at this time in history for kings to have multiple affairs, but they retained their wives separately. In fact, we had a priest in this diocese several years ago. His name was Fitzhenry. And whenever you hear the name Fitzhenry, Fitzwilliam, something like that, it means that Fitz means an illegitimate child, and Fitzhenry was descended from one of the illegitimate children of one of the Henrys. And Fitzwilliam would be descended from one of the illegitimate child of one of King Williams, okay? So that's what that meant. It was just accepted in society. So he decided to seek an annulment of his first marriage, but the Pope would not grant it. Now remember, at this period, the Pope is living in Avignon. He's living in France. And the French king was strongly opposed to anything that might secure Henry's descendants on the throne. You see, there were large sections of France. Remember, when the Vikings came in, the Vikings took over an area of France called Normandy. And when the Normans invaded England, then England owned Normandy, because these were Normans. They came from Normandy. So it was all one. So many territories in France were disputed between the English king and the French king. In fact, Henry had spent much of his earlier life in France, Normandy, protected so that they didn't wipe out the Tudors, who were again fighting for the throne. But anyway, so they were. The French king was very strongly opposed, and the Pope was living in an area of France. And I've mentioned to you before, it was an independent city. Avignon was not under the French king, but he was surrounded by French territory. He was in the area of France. Henry decided to separate from Rome, largely because he could not get the annulment. And in his deciding to separate from Rome, he declared himself head of the English church and then granted himself the annulment as head of the church. The process of his his leaving was very interesting. He brought in all the bishops, and in a very threatening situation, told them that they were to sign an oath of loyalty to him over the Pope. And all the bishops did sign, with the exception of one, which was John Fisher. He was bishop in Oxford. And John Fisher eventually would be beheaded, as would Thomas More. But because the bishops sort of gave in to Henry, it sort of confirmed to Henry that if you knew that much about the church and still agreed with it, that probably he was right. And then Henry, I think you know at that point, began a process of pillaging the church. But I mentioned he executed the other people. He worked tirelessly for the support of Thomas More because of the moral status he held among the people. One of the things to see as a difficulty with regards to this, the woman that he divorced, Catherine of Aragon, was worshipped in the country. People loved her. She was very generous with money and stuff like this to the poor, and people really loved her. And they hated Anne Boleyn. And they hated Anne Boleyn largely because of what it meant for Catherine. They were defending Catherine against Anne Boleyn. But Anne Boleyn used to have vegetables thrown at her and stuff when she was in public. It was really a hard thing. But it was important for Henry to have the marriage recognized as legitimate, or he still, even if Anne Boleyn had 10 boys, none of them would be recognized for the King of England because they would be illegitimate. So he wanted, now Thomas More, first because of his knowledge of law, if he said it was legal, it was legal. On the other side of it, he was a very holy man, so if he advocated it, it would probably be moral as well. So anyway, Henry really wanted him. Finally, Henry had him beheaded. Thomas had given up government office when the king remarried. When the king married Anne Boleyn, Thomas retired from office. And there's a number of very excellent plays built on the way the trial went with Thomas More. Remember, Thomas More, as I mentioned, was a genius as a lawyer. But one of the things in the trial that they asked Thomas More, that he supported the marriage to Catherine. He said, "I've never said anything about that at all." And they said, "Do you support the marriage to Anne Boleyn?" He says, "I've refused to say anything about that at all." They say, "Then you consent to the marriage. Then you oppose the marriage of Anne Boleyn." He says, "I've never said anything at all." They said, "Your silence proves you won't approve of it." And he said, "According to the law, silence is consent." But he never said it, never said he agreed to it. But he could play the law game with them. Finally, they hired some guy who accused him of bribery, something that couldn't be possibly further from Thomas's mind. And then Thomas was condemned. And he was condemned to be hung, drawn, and quartered, which was, I don't know if you've ever heard about how this is done. They hang you, and just before you die, they cut you down. To be drawn, they cut open your abdomen, they pull out your intestines while they're still connected to you and throw them in boiling oil. And then you're quartered. They cut you into 4 pieces, arms, legs, into 4 pieces. But that's hung, drawn, and quartered. However, Henry commuted it to having his head chopped off, which I think is probably a real mercy. Other than declaring himself head of the English church, Henry really did not change anything in the church. He'd had a very difficult time changing any of the doctrines because he defended so many of them in his own books. But anyway, he didn't. He kept the same doctrines, ceremonies, and ecclesiastical positions. So that, like if you were a member of the church in England when the break came, you wouldn't have known anything had changed at all. The changes will come about under Elizabeth. But it would look You have the same clergy, same people. It would be, everything just went on as normal. He did, however, close the monastery and the convents, taking over their lands and looting the church's possessions. This is all actually the work of a man by the name of Oliver, who was in the king's government. No, not Oliver. I forget his first name. His last name was Cromwell. And Cromwell was a member of the government and worked for Henry in the Department of Religion. And he would say, we need to close that monastery. The monks aren't living holy lives. They've got too much money. They throw the monks out. They take the land for the king. They take the gold, the silver, all of the stuff of the altar and all that stuff, melt it all down, sell it. And they did that systematically to all of the monasteries and all of the convents in England. One of the things I pride myself on being an unemotional person in situations like that. But when I went on a visit to England, I love ruins. I think they're very romantic. But anyway, we went around England, and in front of each of the ruins, there's a large plaque that basically gives the history of the monastery or the convent. Every one of them, the last line was Henry VIII. By the time I got to London after doing all that, I couldn't even look at a picture of him. It was just horrendous. But anyway, his young son, Henry's young son, gave Protestant officials the upper hand in government and suppressed the Mass, substituting another during the reign of Elizabeth I. Henry had a son eventually by one of his wives who lived, but he was sickly, and the son died very quickly after he was in. The son then was followed by Mary Tudor, who tried to reestablish the Catholic Church in England. And the real thing that she did that was wrong was she so horribly persecuted the Protestants. And the people in the Church of England didn't even understand they were Protestants. They really believed they were Catholics. They had the same clergy, and everything that went on as normal. So it was a very, very difficult thing. During the reign of Elizabeth, England became mainly Episcopal or Anglican. If you've ever heard these two things, Episcopal and Anglican, Episcopalians are what Catholics called the Church of England. And we call them Episcopalians because we consider them Protestant, but they're unusual among Protestants because they have bishops, Episcopal. Protestants tended to look at them and call them Anglicans because for the Protestants, they looked like Catholics, but they spoke English, Anglo. So the two terms came out of the two communities, and it was very clearly established then. That's also the time, incidentally, when the Catholic Church teaches that the English Church lost orders. Like we believe orders passed down from the apostles through history. But what happened was Elizabeth picked out a priest called John, Anyway, Kramer was his last name. Kramer, and made him Archbishop of Canterbury. He was never a bishop. Made him Archbishop of Canterbury. And when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, he ordained the bishops in England. So that not being ordained by a bishop himself, we believe he lost apostolic succession. And then the ordinations were over at that point. In 1532, we have a man by the name of John Calvin. He was a very well-educated man from France, and he came from a very, very strict Catholic family. He had a powerful experience, a religious experience at a certain point in his life, and separated himself from the Roman Catholic Church. He had this real powerful experience, and he separated himself from the church, ceased to be involved in the church. He published a major work. It was just probably finished shortly before his death. He worked on it for a long time. It's two huge volumes with very small print. And the title of it was The Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's still probably one of the most important theological works. He agreed with Luther's basic principles, but he added predestination, which was the specific thing he brought. One of the things about Calvin was rather respectful of Catholics and other religions. He was a powerful preacher, and when he went into an area, people almost always followed him. And he's just a very powerful preacher, and he was a strong influence. Today, most of the religions that we know as Protestant in the United States flow from Calvin. They flow from his particular views. His principal follower was John Knox, who came from Scotland. And John Knox took the principles back to Scotland and founded the Presbyterian Church. And a remarkable number of the founding fathers of the United States were Presbyterian. And so that's where it comes in. But Calvinism, I think, is the major stream in Protestantism today, as the original one was, The original one was Luther. But the major stream today is Calvin, with one thing, that if you notice in the United States, churches are really independent, so that no church has a bishop over it anymore. They're really independent. Now, in the Presbyterian Church, there are structures, one above another. But in the United States, we have Presbyterian principles, basically, but they're held in churches that don't have a structure like that at all. The city of Geneva invited Calvin into the country to reorganize it as a theocracy. A theocracy is a country that is directly under God. The head of the government in a theocracy is God. Okay? What's an example of a theocracy today? Israel. Israel claims to be a democracy, claims to be a theocracy. As a result of that, the Israeli government has to be very careful how they make laws and everything with regards to Scripture. They have to be very careful because they have to answer to the strictly Orthodox Jews. It is a theocracy. So they invited Calvin to come establish a theocracy. Now, as soon as I say theocracy, the idea of a theocracy is very good, that a government and everything should be completely in harmony with God and everything. It just so happens that in a theocracy, that isn't what happens. If you have a Catholic theocracy, it's basically the Catholic Church who claims to understand what God wants. If you have Calvin establish it, it's basically a Calvinistic church, because Calvin claims to understand what God wants. In England, it's the Anglican Church, okay? So that if you attempt a theocracy, you need to know it's always a colored theocracy. It's never a pure theocracy. So, he created 4 basic offices. So there are 4 offices. One of them is pastors. And the purpose of a pastor is basically to perform the sacraments. That's what a pastor is supposed to do, and preach. So we have pastors, sacraments, and preaching. Secondly, we have teachers. Notice teachers are not pastors. Teachers teach lessons on the Bible. So teachers are simply to teach the Bible. You notice with regards to the pastors can preach on all kinds of things. Like, see, in our tradition, the preacher is to preach on the Bible. But in this system, there are independent teachers whose job it is just to teach the Bible. They don't preach. They don't do sacraments. They just teach the Bible. The third group is lay elders, and they watched over the conduct of the people. Lay elders are a curious thing. An early Calvinistic country is Holland. And one of the things about Holland that is absolutely fascinating, that if you go through the older section of Holland near the canals, you'll notice that the front of a house is sitting there and they're very large windows on the front of the house. And one window on the side, you look, and there's a corridor that goes down, and you can see clear through the entire house. And off that corridor are the doors to all the other rooms. And the reason they did that was so the elders could go by and see the religion was being observed. They could see you are not going into someone else's room. You are not working on the Sabbath. Just so they did that. But anyway, the lay elders are the ones who are supposed to watch in the community. I think one really advantage of that is the elders being lay elders. I think sometimes lay people have a better understanding of the practice of the faith in a family with children than the clergy do, certainly in the Catholic Church, where we have a celibate clergy. So there's real advantage to having lay people in that role. But they became sort of moral police and were greatly feared. And the last group is deacons. Deacons' sole job was to take care of finances. Now, again, if you look at the early church, in the early church, the apostles had deacons take over the finances and things so that the apostles could preach. Okay? So you have the clergy preaching, doing sacraments, the deacons in charge of the money. But he wanted them to be educated, because one of the big problems of the Reformation is Catholics were not educated. That's what allowed the break. So he wanted them to be educated. So we have teachers as a group, okay? Over all of this was a council of 6 pastors and 12 lay elders who watched over everything. And incidentally, that's called a presbytery, okay? So they have individual jobs, but together they watch over the whole process. Very, very well organized. Simplicity and severity were the rule. Things were very, very simple, but had to be observed, okay? So very severe, very simple. Feast days, vestments, statues, elaborate ceremonies, devotion to the saints, they were all abolished, okay? One of the things that's really fascinating is that if you visit Geneva today, if you can, as part of the tour, go into the basement of the church, usually in the basement of the church you will find preserved the statues, sometimes the stained glass windows and that sort of thing. The churches became very clean. All that stuff was taken out. But if you look at some countries, when they went through the Reformation type thing, a lot of that stuff was destroyed. A lot of art was really lost, but not in Switzerland. So they have those pieces or in museums and stuff, but they are not, they're not in the churches. The churches are very clean. They're white walls, they're clear glass, it's a very clean church. Services were psalms, prayers, preaching. Now, dancing, cards, singing popular songs were absolutely forbidden. They watch you for this. Do you see people playing cards? Do you see people dancing? Okay? Do you see people singing popular songs? Books, as well as conversations, were censored, and punishments were severe. You had to follow this stuff very closely. Now, if you wanted to be a Catholic, you could be a Catholic, and you could worship as a Catholic. But it didn't go on publicly. You had to be in an area because you used vestments and sacraments and stuff, so you had to do. And there's some places in Holland that are very interesting where there's a block, let's say a city block, and there are houses on 4 sides of the city block and everything. But if you go through the houses, you find in the center is a church. The center is a Catholic church. But Catholics held it that way so that they had their religion and everything, but were not confronting the police outside. One of the things that I think is something to really be aware of is that the Dutch were one of the most tolerant people throughout history. They were very tolerant of different religions. And so you find that in Holland, and you find that in Geneva as well. okay, Geneva, because they were all part of the same thing at this time. Ministers trained in Calvin's academy carried Calvinism to France. In France, they became known as the Huguenots, okay? To England, Scotland, the Netherlands, Germany, Hungary, and the Americas. The movement came to the shores in the Puritans and remains today as the Presbyterian community. The Puritans, they came to be called Puritans in England, one of the branches of Calvinism, largely because they carried that thing of the very, plain churches and this sort of thing. So, in 1514, Paul III opened the Council of Trent, a result of the changes that had come to the hierarchy in the council in the Catholic Church. So as a result of what's going on now with regards to the Reformation, all that, they finally decide to call the council. Now I want you to remember earlier, who wanted the council? First of all, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a deeply devotional Catholic and wanted the council because he saw his country dividing between Catholics and Lutherans. So he wanted the council. Who else wanted it? The Lutherans wanted the council so they could debate theologically the differences and come to a way in which Lutheran practice could be allowed within the Catholic Church, okay? And, like, for instance, if you are a person who believes it's absolutely immoral to eat meat and all this sort of stuff, and you want to follow it very strictly, no Catholic would see any problem with you being a Catholic and vegan. There's no issue. But that wasn't true at this time. At this time, if you deviated from the norm in any country, from what was the norm, you were seen as heretical, okay? So, he was an older man, a humanist, and a child of the Renaissance. Now remember, the humanists do concentrate on human beings. He took his job very seriously. He appointed cardinals of intellectual and spiritual merit. Amazing, like before the Reformation, remember people were buying the office of cardinal, and people were buying their offices, and you were putting in people who were yes men to yourself. You weren't looking for intellectuals, but he was smart, and he brought in people who were both intellectual and spiritual. He formed from them a commission to direct reform with complete power from him, okay? So this commission was to be active and bring about the reform in the church. Acting on their findings, he addressed the papal abuse of authority. So the abuse of papal authority was the Pope acted like a king rather than a pastor. And so they addressed this thing. Second thing, they addressed the church's involvement in politics. The church was playing the political game, largely because the Pope was a political leader. So they addressed that. The next thing they addressed was the ignorance of the clergy. One of the things the Council of Trent will start seminaries. I would say until I studied church history, I honestly believe the church always had seminaries. You'd think you'd always educate the clergy. Well, in the early days of the church, a lot of clergy were very well educated. They were the best educated people in society, but a lot of the clergy were completely ignorant. Educated clergy usually taught, but the people in the parishes were very ignorant of the faith often. The next thing they addressed was the lack of earnestness among clergy and religious. A lot of people went into religious life just to live an easy life. A lot of people went into the clergy as just an opportunity to get a different kind of life. So, and if you came into the clergy to do that, you'd largely end up married while still pastor of a parish and doing this sort of thing. And so a lot of people in religious life, remember that was one of the things that Teresa of Avila did. She tried to get the convents to go back to the strict founding of the Carmelites. And he addressed the unchristian atmosphere in the city of Rome. Okay, the city of Rome had been very, very corrupted. And so the Pope, as a result of this now, the Pope is once again seen as the spiritual leader of the church. They always saw him as the political leader, but who was the spiritual leader of the church would sort of shift theologically. That had to do with who people looked to. I'll tell you, in England, the spiritual leader of the church was Thomas More. If anyone looked at the spirituality of the church, it was Thomas More, not the bishops, not the leaders there. Pope Paul then went to work on the long-demanded council, but a huge amount had changed now. The Protestants were now opposed because of the many advances they had made and were making all over the Christian world. Originally, the Protestants wanted the council so that they could find the freedom to flourish and develop and this sort of thing. Now they've taken over whole countries. They have no trouble finding a place to flourish and develop. They don't need the Catholic Church for that, okay? Conflicts between the French king and the house of the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs basically controlled Austria-Hungary, that area. This hindered the choice of a site, and if they could not be convinced to approve the council, there was a real chance that they would prevent their own bishops from attending. So, like, for instance, if the French king didn't have the council in the city he wanted, the French king would say, well, the French bishops aren't coming. If the Habsburgs controlled a huge part of the world at this time, almost most of what had been the Holy Roman Empire. And if they were not pleased, then they would say none of their bishops could attend. And if the French bishops and the Habsburg bishops didn't attend, there'd be precious few people at this particular council. It was agreed that the council would be held in Trent, Italy. The Protestants were invited, but they chose not to attend. There were 21 bishops there, 5 heads of religious orders, and while there were many disagreements and delays, this was a great impetus to the reform of the Catholic Church, okay? So this did an awful lot to reform the Catholic Church. You notice how few people are there, 21 bishops. I bet there were close to 1,000 bishops at the Second Vatican Council. A lot of that has to do with the size of the church. The church is much bigger and everything. And this would provide what the thing needed. If you look at history, you'll find out that this council stopped for several years for plagues, wars, one thing or another. But when it was finally completed, it had done its job. Okay? So we will pick it up there when we come back next week. Thank you very much.